Сьогодні маємо вагоме рішення міжнародної юстиції.
We have a significant decision of international justice in a case that has real prospects. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Putin. This is a historic decision that will lead to historic accountability. The head of a terrorist state and another Russian official have officially become suspects of a war crime in the deportation of Ukrainian children, the illegal displacement of thousands of our children to the territory of the terrorist state. In the criminal proceedings being investigated by our law enforcement officers, more than 16,000 cases of forced deportation of Ukrainian children by the occupier have already been recorded. But the real full number of deportees could be much higher. To carry such a criminal operation would be impossible without the order of the highest leader of the terrorist state. To separate children from their families, to deprive them of any opportunity to contact their relatives, to hide children on the territory of Russia, to disperse them to remote regions, all this is obviously Russian state policy, state decisions and state evil, which starts exactly with the top officials of the state. I'm grateful to team of prosecutor Karim Khan and the International Criminal Court, to everyone in the world who helps us fight for justice. I'm grateful for the integrity and willingness to bring those responsible to justice. So far, slightly more than 300 children have been returned out of all those who were taken by force, stolen from Ukraine. Obviously, we have to return all of them. Obviously, we will continue to do everything for this, for the return of every Ukrainian woman, every child, and for the real responsibility of all those guilty of this deportation, from the head of the terrorist state to all the executors.
This is a historic moment in the conflict in Ukraine. The International Criminal Court, which operates independently, has issued an indictment for President Putin and the Children's Commissioner for appalling crimes against children. And whilst they operate independently, it's really important the international community support them and give them the tools to do the job, which is why I'll be hosting on Monday with my Dutch opposite number 40 countries from around the world to give them the support to conduct the investigations, to look after witnesses, to care for the victims so that they can see this through and we hope have accountability for those appalling crimes. It's going to be, I suspect, a long journey, but people said that about Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and many of those people responsible for the carnage ended up in the dock of a court. I think in the short term it will be very hard for President Putin to move around the world because there will be so many countries who are parties to the ICC who will be duty bound to arrest him. But what's really important right now is that those members of the international community who have supported the ICC step up to the plate, make sure they've got the forensic investigative support, the technical support with the investigations, support with witnesses, and that's what we'll be doing in London with the Dutch and all of our colleagues and partners from around the world. Well, if you look at prosecutions and international prosecutions in the past, they've often gone in phases. But I do think that this initial indictment is very significant. It focuses on crimes against children, the forcible deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia, an appalling crime, clearly contrary to all the basic rules and norms of international warfare. And I think it's quite right that there's accountability for that discrete crime without prejudice to whatever else the ICC decides to do.
The International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation. This is an important moment in the process of justice before the ICC. The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
All right. Good afternoon. There will be guests after me.
You've long stressed the need for accountability for what's happened in Ukraine. What is the Secretary-General's reaction to the ICC arrest warrants announced in the last hour or so, which include an arrest warrant for the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin?
As we've said many times before here, the International Criminal Court is independent of the Secretariat. We do not comment on their actions.
But does it have any impact in the way the UN operates with regard to the President of Russia? For example, if President Putin wanted to visit any UN headquarters, whether it was in Geneva, Vienna, New York, would he be permitted to enter? Will the Secretary-General still talk or meet with President Putin?
I don't want to answer hypothetical questions because, as you know, issues of travel involve others. We will continue, as a general rule, the Secretary-General will speak to whomever he needs to speak in order to deal with the issues that are in front of him.
Does he, though, fear that this is a threat to diplomacy? Because President Putin is clearly the person who started the war in Ukraine. One might assume that you need President Putin to bring the war to an end. One can't see, or I can't see, President Putin being allowed to come by the host country, the US, to the UN General Assembly High-Level Week. I can't see how you could foresee another summit between President Biden and President Putin, as we saw in Geneva. Is this a threat, this arrest warrant, to the diplomacy that you're working so hard for?
As I said, and this applies across the board, the Secretary-General will always speak to whomever he needs to speak to in order to advance our work.
But lots of other people won't be able to speak to President Putin.
I can only speak for him. Tell us that 40% of the provinces are under emergency. Secretaries General will speak to whomever they need to speak to advance the issues that are on their desks.
Regardless, there's the warrant or not.
One thing that we should not forget is the fact that no immediate arrest is going to happen. Putin is not stupid. He's not going to travel abroad to a country where he might be arrested. So in some ways, of course, it is historical. It's a really big case, one that has, the war in Ukraine and the alleged war crimes has been getting so much international attention from the media, from the public. So in that regard, it's really historical. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't get too excited because any potential trial we're not going to see in a month or in a year. So it's going to be a bit of a wait until we see what actually comes out of all of this. These kinds of cases that go after leaders that are far away from the actual perpetration of crimes physically tends to be challenging. So as we have seen in many other trials and many other courts, that's always difficult. But again, it's also not impossible. So, we have seen cases of, for example, Radovan Karadzic at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He was also not there physically for any of the torture, any of the murders, and yet he is now serving a lifelong sentence for many of those crimes. So it's difficult, but it's not impossible. In terms of what kind of, what is the calculation for Putin, I think, he is not going to be able to travel pretty much anywhere else beyond the countries that are either clearly allies or at least somewhat aligned to Russia, either for pragmatic reasons or, historical ties or whatever else. So it definitely does diminish his ability to act around the world. It's more, I think it's possibly more likely that it will make him cling to power even more, even though nothing seems to have suggested that he intended to let go of power, right? So I think it's all going to depend basically on what happens with the war and what happens to his regime. I think it's unlikely that there's going to be a significant regime change anytime soon, because I think to a certain extent it was a matter of time. It was also a question of who individually, specifically, would be indicted. Would it be Putin or someone else? And also, finally, I guess the big question was what the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Court was going to focus on. So kind of which aspect of many alleged war crimes and other international crimes that have been going on in Ukraine in the past year. So to a certain extent, we were expecting something, but I think it it was very difficult to know, of course, in advance what specifically would be coming, and at least it's a symbolic act. It's an act where the International Criminal Court's prosecutor's office sends a message about what kind of behavior they deem and they intend to prove is unlawful. So they send a message to other warring parties elsewhere in the world about what is or is not allowed.
Realistically, there's almost no chance that we are going to see President Putin in the dock in the short term. So it's just going to be very difficult to get custody of him in the short to even medium term. But that fact alone shouldn't undermine the significance of what the International Criminal Court has done today. By charging Putin and by the court saying they believe that there are reasonable grounds to hold him to account for these war crimes, it sends a very strong message to the entire political community that is involved in trying to negotiate an end to this war. It also sends a very strong message to the victims of these crimes that they are not alone in this, that what they've suffered is being seen by the highest court that we have in the world. And interestingly, I think one of the most important but perhaps least visible signals that it sends is to dissidents inside Russia. That this is a charge that delegitimizes Putin in the eyes of the world. Russia is pointing out that it is not a party to the court. It also loves to highlight the fact that the US too is not a party to the court. But that doesn't change the reality that being a party to the court is not the only way that the court can get jurisdiction. It has other ways of getting jurisdiction. One of them is when the UN Security Council, for example, refers a situation to the court. And another one is what we have in this situation, where the territory on which crimes are being committed, that state gives the court jurisdiction. Any state that is a party to the Rome Statute, that is part of the court, has the legal obligation under that statute to arrest an indictee that travels into their territory. Now, we've seen examples in the past. For example, there was an arrest warrant against the then Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir. He did travel to some countries that were part of the ICC and they didn't arrest them. But that was a really big deal when they failed to execute that obligation and they were brought before the court. So that obligation is real, and I think it is for that reason that we are unlikely to see Putin traveling to any state that is signed up to the court. The charges that we've seen come out today of the unlawful deportation and transportation of children are the first, but they're not going to be the last charges that we see in this conflict. I do think it's important that they were the first, though, because of the deterrent signal that they send. And the court was very clear in its message, its announcement of this, that it was hoping that by making it public, this charge, that it was going to send a deterrent signal to those who are still involved in the program. So while we can debate whether or not Putin could be deterred by anything at this moment, the reality is that it takes people to implement that program of the forcible transfer of children, and they are now on notice that there is going to be accountability for what is happening with those transfer programs. As a prosecutor, what you're really going for is to faithfully represent what is happening in the conflict. And what we have in this conflict is a disproportionate amount of crimes being committed by one side. And so it's simply an accurate reflection of that reality that we are going to see that that is where the bulk of the prosecutions go towards.